It's great to be here this afternoon, and I thought the morning was great, but wow, to follow Ms. Cynthia Ayers, that's going to be a tough act to follow. But we have three people here who are going to give it a really good shot. We're going to plow on, but that was really, really interesting, forward-thinking, and we really do have to get out of this box that we're in and shift some paradigms, so well taken. Thank you. We're going to talk about cyber warfare and cyber attacks, et cetera, and we have three experts on the panel to discuss that. The whole cryptocurrency I found extremely interesting this morning. The three speakers were fabulous. I thought I learned a lot. The ransomware attacks, all of those, most of those are paid in cryptocurrency. For policing and the police in the audience and that, the law enforcement, know how difficult, time-consuming that it is to follow these. They are followable, apparently, but it takes a lot of resources, and law enforcement, I think, suffer from the lack of resources and sometimes the lack of training. So we're looking at criminals, we're looking at terrorists. Everyone is in the mix now, and it's been spoken a couple of times in the deep dark web. That really is kind of the Harper's Bazaar. I mean, everything is down there. We spend a lot of time in there for various clients doing a number of things, but you can buy anything and everything. And when you think of whether you buy credentials or people or hits or weapons or whatever, everything is for sale at a price. But the thought living in the north half of this North American continent, the weather always strikes me. So I was down south. I just came back yesterday, I guess. And so it's a little chilly, but still very nice. But with a kinetic attack in January, can you imagine how we'd be feeling? It'd be pretty harsh. And how the heck would we get ourselves out of that? What would we do? What's in place? Who knows? Do we have good plans? Sometimes I feel we might have some plans, but how would we unfold them, get them out to get them working? And you know what it's like, a crowd of people after 2-3 days, all of a sudden becomes a mob. So some pretty nasty things I think would happen. And I don't think people are really thinking about it, and I'm speaking about it domestically here. So let me introduce the panel. So to my left is Dr. Jardine, and I'm sorry I have to go to the next one here, Paul. Paul and I haven't met, so welcome, Paul Hanley, Deloitte. And I'm sorry, Dr. Jardine is with Virginia Tech, and of course Dr. Geers at the end, Commodore Research here in Toronto. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Jardine.
Great, well thank you all for sticking around after lunch, and thank you for the kind introduction, and to the McKinsey Institute for inviting me to speak today. What I'm going to be talking about is the prevalence of Bitcoin addresses and wallets on dark web illegal marketplaces, particularly those dedicated to the sale of guns and weapons, mafia services, and drugs. And so by way of a short overview, the presentation itself really has three components. The first is a brief sort of tour through the public and the politicians' view of cryptocurrencies. Then I'll talk a little bit about some new data that I've collected together with some colleagues in Virginia that basically indexes a significant portion of the Tor-hosted dark web to really look for general trends in terms of prevalence, and I will present 1 month's worth of data here. And then I'm going to conclude by talking about what I see as sort of three implications of what I've found for policy and for policymakers. So today, the Center for International Governance Innovation, in which I'm a fellow, just based down the road in Waterloo, they're releasing some survey results from their third iteration now of the CG Ipsos Global Survey on Internet Security and Trust, which is a little bit of a mouthful, but it's a very good survey of 23 countries and Hong Kong. So we're talking about slightly over 24,000 respondents globally, and it gives us a good sort of global picture, and really one of the only global pictures that I've come across of various trends in the internet ecosystem. So this particular tranche of data focuses on cryptocurrency, and there's a series of questions that I think are relevant for what we've been discussing over the course of today. Now, it's a little bit smaller than I'd anticipated in terms of the projection, but you sort of get the point here that one of the core findings, that's not good, there we go. There it is. So that one of the core findings from the results released today is that only 1 in 10, or roughly 11% of individuals globally, had any intention of using cryptocurrencies or being very likely to use cryptocurrencies in 2017. So this sort of belies the rapid price increase we've seen with Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies over the same period. But also sort of speaking to what individuals sort of brought up earlier today, there's a big difference between countries in this global sample. So well-developed countries with really well-established credit and banking systems are all clustered near the bottom with low likelihoods of usage, and countries like Indonesia, Egypt, India, and Turkey that have sort of less well-developed finance sectors tend to be a bit higher up in the sort of global distribution. Now, what's relevant for my presentation and for the sort of security side discussion of cryptocurrencies is that 65% of individuals said they were either somewhat or very unlikely to be using cryptocurrencies. And so what we did as a part of this survey effort was actually try to drill down among that 65% and try to figure out what their rationales were for non-usage. And so we asked an additional follow-on question, which again, I apologize for this sort of miniature scale, it looked better on my computer, that we asked an additional set of follow-on questions where they basically had a list of potential rationales for non-use, and they were allowed to sort of just pick a la carte from this list. The top motivation for non-use happens to be they don't know how to get cryptocurrencies, sort of speaking, as we've sort of intimated at several points, to the idea that these are sort of complex systems in the mind of the general public, and that's a big barrier to adoption. What's most relevant for me is actually that right up there in the top three at 27% was the idea that individuals did not want to use cryptocurrencies because those currency forms are associated in the public's mind with criminal behavior and with criminal misdeeds. So CG also today launched a Twitter poll, always scientific Twitter poll, to get at the same sort of sentimentality. What they found so far, we have 12 respondents, so we're not really breaking the bank here, but about 65% of people are saying they associate cryptocurrencies with criminal behavior in sort of the Twitterverse as well. So this is sort of, I think, speaking to what we've hinted at over the course of the day about the sort of PR problem that cryptocurrencies might have in terms of their legitimate uses versus their ties with criminal behavior. And I think this general public view that I've been presenting here is well mirrored by the politicians' view as well. So in early November, Secretary Steve Mnuchin was speaking to Yahoo Finance, and in a series of public remarks, he basically commented on the fact that regulation of Bitcoin is quite high up on the Treasury Department's radar in terms of important next steps. And what I think is most telling about his commentary here was really this idea that the reason why Bitcoin needs to become regulated is simply because we don't want a dark web that is funded by Bitcoin, as he said. Now, with high-profile takedowns of Alpha Bay and other dark web marketplaces that had Bitcoin built in as part of its functionality and payment system, this sort of emphasis makes sense, but I'll get to, I think, what my results are telling us is sort of a bit more cautionary of a tale. And so that really brings me into that second part of the debate, where myself and some colleagues from Virginia have undertaken an effort to try to index part of that unindexed dark web that's hosted on the Tor network. And so during the month of September, for which I'll be presenting data, we indexed slightly over 33,000 dark web unique .onion URLs. And during this same period, the Tor project, which manages the network, indicated that they were observing and had up and running about 49,000 unique .onion URLs. So we're basically, the data that I'm drawing on is about a 70% view of the Tor-hosted dark web. That's what those are supposed to be populated with, but neither here nor there. So in terms of trying to fulfill my primary task of talking about general prevalence levels, what I essentially did was use the crawling engine to basically search for all sites on a given day that had some ties to either drug sales, weapon sales, or mafia services, and then using Boolean search logic to sort of parse the HTML that we were pulling down, basically see which sites were selling those services and also made explicit reference to Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies. And that with those two numbers, I was able to basically express a proportion of sites selling these illegal services on a given day that happened to be using cryptocurrencies as an express means of payment, and in particular Bitcoin as a cryptocurrency. Now, going into this, I kind of had the expectation that I think the general public has, or that Secretary Mnuchin was kind of giving voice to, which is I expected a prevalency rate of around 80, 90, 95%, somewhere up very high. And what I found was actually a little bit of a different story. And so this gets unpacked in the next few slides, where I unpack all of the discrete trends, including the aggregated trend for what I call the vice category, which is all the different ones melded together. But right away, you can sort of notice a lot of variation and variance between days, but also that we're barely even cresting 90% only once. That the general overall prevalence of Bitcoin on illegal marketplace sites tends to be lower than I think the public would initially expect or anticipate. So running through very briefly the sort of disaggregated trends for the sale of drugs on .onion URLs, you have a fair degree of variance, bouncing from a low of a little under 30 to a high of over 80. And over the period of September, which is the 30 days with the 30,000 sites, you tend to have a slightly escalatory trend, but it's 1 month's worth of data, so chances are it's probably more noise than actual results. The trend for Mafia services is even more subject to variance intraday, where it's jumping from 20% to over 90%. And the trend for weapon sales is actually more constrained and lower overall in terms of an expressed proportion than we see with any of the other categories. When I combined it all together to give me the vice trend, which was essentially all three put into one big bundle, what you see is basically that Bitcoin and being paired with illegal sites on the dark web tends to be constrained between this 30 and 60% band. That in terms of prevalency rate, we're talking about 30 to 60%. And so I took, since I had 1 month worth of data for this particular presentation, I basically took all of the days, aggregated them together, creating a total. And that total gives us a sense of what are the actual proportions in terms of the rough split over the course of that 1 month. And there, what we basically found, again, it's supposed to be values, there aren't, is essentially a 50-50 split. So 50.5% of sites had Bitcoin being explicitly paired in terms of the HTML content that we were pulling down with reference to some sort of illegal service or good that was being sold or proffered on that particular site. And so this was surprising to me. It was contrary to what I'd expected, but I think there's some reasons why this may be the case that I can get into in a quick second. So these empirical results, again, only 1 month's worth, but I think a fair bit of data sort of going into it, suggest three things for policymakers that we can that are relevant to discuss, and I think bring up some of the sort of nuance to these findings. So the first thing that I want to talk about policy-wise is the idea that 50-50 split is probably artificially low. That the crawler, the tool that we're using to actually index and retrieve the HTML content, is probably producing a lot of false negatives. And there's a few different ways in which that's likely happening. One is criminal sites could be trying to put in barriers to crawling engines. That seems like a pretty reasonable thing to do if you are a criminal. That prevents indexing by law enforcement, which is a pretty effective tool. So CAPTCHA windows, login credentials on websites, all of these things could be potential impediments. The crawler has login credentials to several sites, and so some of those may be less of a barrier than we think. But I've also seen in diving into some dark websites, sometimes you even simply have a list of services on offer with no explicit prices or means of payment coupled with an email address. And then you would have to contact the vendor. They would then provide you with the pricing and with the means of payment. So rather than publicize that this is my Bitcoin wallet, they basically keep that to themselves and share it only on a case-by-case basis after having vetted a consumer. So the first point is essentially the automated system that we're developing is producing some false negatives that could be overcome by human analysts. So you want to keep analysts involved in the loop. When we're dealing with large volumes of data, for example, 30,000 sites in a single month, the urge is to basically substitute automatic processes in favor of sort of more intensive person hours. And that's advantageous in a sense, but also has its limitations. And I think it's important to recognize that from a policy perspective, we need to keep well-trained analysts in the loop in order to be able to handle some of these intricacies and countermeasures on the part of the criminal. The second point is that even though I just said that is artificially low, that 50-50 split, I also think there's some reason to suspect that we should take that expression of proportion somewhat seriously. This is a very large and comprehensive view that we're getting with 70% of dark websites that are hosted on the Tor network. And so it's important to basically say, okay, so this may in fact be a closer representation of the actual prevalence of cryptocurrencies on illegal marketplaces than the public view in terms of they're everywhere, it's all being funded by Bitcoin. What that means is that there's a very real possibility that alternative means of payment or money laundering or all the rest may still be alive and well and active. So this could be anything from transfers through the traditional financial sector. Someone could set up a Venmo account if they wanted. They could do cash in advance of services provided. They could even do something akin to a barter exchange, where I would provide hacking services to someone in exchange for a quantity of drugs. So there's a lot of ways in which payments could be facilitated on the dark web or even on the surface web to do with dark web transactions that are important to try to regulate if we're trying to think about how to combat crime on the sort of seedy underbelly of the internet that is the dark web. And so it's again to sort of think more holistically in terms of the focus of efforts in regulation, because we don't want to say cryptocurrencies are the bane of all existence on the dark web, therefore that's all we need to do and focus on. And the last thing that I want to talk about is really exemplified by both the low proportions of Bitcoin that I'm finding on, in the crawling indexer, as well as the comments by Secretary Mnuchin. That the idea that we want to focus in on Bitcoin can be itself inherently problematic, that there is in this space, as there is elsewhere in the digital economy, a very severe innovation regulation lag. And so you see criminals already substituting away from Bitcoin, partially because of its pseudo-anonymous characteristics that we've spoken about, although dark wallet and tumblers and all these things help sort of correct for that. But criminals are already moving towards Monero and Zcoin and Ether and all the rest, simply because they have better privacy protections built in. And so I could imagine a scenario where the Treasury Department implements a series of regulatory measures designed to keep Bitcoin from being the currency of choice on the dark web, and by the time it actually comes into effect next year, the year after that, whenever it may actually become an actuality, you basically have criminals on the dark web almost never using Bitcoin, having switched in total to a different type of currency, and you've effectively ended up regulating, and I'll end with this point, just ended up regulating what turns out to be a legitimate means of payment for small business and everything like this. And so you can end up sort of shooting yourself in the foot with excessive regulation designed to combat criminality when the criminals have already moved on because of their faster iterative cycle than the government's able to keep up with. So thank you all very much for your time, and that will be the end of my remarks.
Next speaker, Mr. Paul Hanley, who's lead with cyber in Deloitte. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you for having me here. So I was going to spend probably the next 10 or 15 minutes or so just talking about some of the challenges of cyber and also cryptocurrency in the context of financial services. Now, some of my comments I think will hopefully resonate with some of the comments that have been provided so far. And I think, again, I do a lot of work with financial services organisations. I speak to boards all the time about the latest challenges. And it's interesting to note that their view of cyber has been changing even over the past sort of few years. I'll give an example, which is ransomware, and I know that ransomware has already been sort of discussed a number of times. But my view is, whenever I would ask a board, financial services, or in fact even outside of financial services, would you pay a ransom, a cyber ransomware demand? The response was always typically absolutely not. We would never pay. But that's changed. And I'll give an example as to why that's started to change. And I think, for me, one of the kind of watershed moments is CryptoLocker 4. And for those that don't know, I'll give you kind of the context between CryptoLocker 4 versus more traditional ransomware. So I first got involved with ransomware in the 90s, on the good side, I should add. And I think in the sort of good old days of ransomware, it used to be you suddenly get this message on screen, pay this ransom, otherwise you've lost your data on your machine. So what would you do? You'd ring up your IT department and you'd say, well, I've got this ransomware, what do I do? They would then come along, take the backup from yesterday or the day before, rebuild it, everything's good again. You might have lost a couple of days worth of data, but not too much of a big deal. If you look at some of the latest types of ransomware, they're much more intelligent in the way that they work. So what they do now is they lie dormant for a number of months. And so all of a sudden you get infected by this ransomware. You don't know you've been infected by it until, let's say, 6 months work after the initial infection. And you've had all of these backups being taken and so forth. So all of a sudden you get this message on screen, pay this ransomware, otherwise you've lost your data. So what do? You ring up your IT department, they go and get the backups from the day before, but they don't work. You try the week before, it doesn't work, etc., etc. So all of a sudden, the criminals will suddenly realise that this is a great way of making out a really legitimate pain point in the organisation. You've lost 6 months worth of your data. And again, the way the ransomware is now working, it's not just infecting you. Maybe you're the one that opened that email, you're the one that was targeted under the phishing attack, but actually the way it works is it's spidering out in the organisation. So all of a sudden it's infecting those around you and your colleagues as a whole. So what they've been able to do, the bad guys, is to actually infect whole systems, whole servers, even websites, for example. So they've been very creative in what they've been doing, but really focusing on the psychology of individuals to click on those links or whatever else they're doing. So I think for me, ransomware is a big challenge, and it's certainly something that, again, has been focusing the mind of boards and others more recently. Other interesting things that, again, I would say are keeping people awake, particularly in financial services, are, again, if you look at the dark web, things like the Enigma forum. And I'm not sure how many people in the room are familiar with the Enigma forum, maybe show of hands? No? Okay. So for those that don't know, the Enigma forum is a fairly interesting place if you can gain access to it. And effectively, you click on, if you go to the Enigma forum, it has a list of organisations. You click on the name of the organisation, and it has a list of their employees. And it's not all employees that are on that list. These are people that could be blackmailed. So these are people that may be having an affair with somebody else, and or maybe they've got a gambling problem that they haven't declared to their employer, or maybe some sort of criminal record. So what the bad guys have been able to do is work out what secrets there are in that organisation, so that if you want to, you can extort money out of them, or whatever else you want to. So again, if you imagine it in the sort of good old days, somebody would ring you up and say, give me your username and password. And obviously you say, well, I'm not going to do that, I'm not stupid. You put the phone down and that's the end of that. But now what they say is, give me your username and password, otherwise I'm going to tell everybody your secret. And again, there's some fairly detailed information on there, as in when the affair started, let's say, who you're having the affair with, the name of your children, where they go to school, all of this sort of stuff. So again, if you start talking to the person on the phone and say, I know all this information, I'm going to start telling everybody, there's actually quite a good chance that that person will give their genuine username and password. And what you've now done is bypassed all of the security controls in the organisation. So again, people spending millions and billions and whatever else on the latest cyber technologies, and something as simple as blackmail is the way to be able to get to the heart of an organisation. For those that may be Googling while I'm talking, the Enigma forum doesn't actually exist anymore. Because it actually got shut down. When people like me talk about it too much, people kind of shut it down and open a new one. So just to say, there are a number of other of these sites that are now open, but I'm not going to tell you what they're called. And it's funny, I have presented to various organisations, and often people follow me out of the presentation afterwards and say, well, can you find out what people know about me? So I will be watching to see who follows me out. Anyway, so that's a couple of things, just conscious of time. So some of the other things that, again, are concerning to financial services organisations are, I would say, data integrity is a big issue, it's a big challenge. And what I mean by that is, just imagine somebody gives you some extortion note and says, we've changed your data, we've changed the data within your systems. And they're not telling you what data it is they've changed. But it could be as simple as just going through all the systems and changing the number 1 to the number 2. How much of an impact would that have to the average financial services organisation? Just as something as simple as that. So again, this is now a big concern to particularly financial services organisations, because they're, I would say, ahead of the curve compared to other sectors, but there's many other sectors that are now trying to work out, well, what do they do about this sort of stuff? Other interesting things, Delilah. I don't know how many people have heard about the Delilah malware. Show of hands, anybody? Okay, one. So Delilah, I would say, is a bit of a take on the likes of the Enigma forum. And in fact, you can almost say that they're linked. So if you get infected by Delilah, again, what it typically does is it's residing, let's say, on your mobile phone or your iPad or whatever other device you actually have. And it's constantly recording. Even though you don't realise it's recording what you're saying, it's recording what you're doing. So as you're walking around the house or whatever, it's just recording. And it's uploading to a certain area of the internet. And again, it's not to extort you today, because maybe your job isn't very extortable, you're not a particularly important person right now. But let's say in 3 years' time, 5 years' time, 10 years' time, you suddenly are an incredibly important person with a very senior role. All of a sudden, there's all these secrets, maybe those things that you said many years ago, where somebody can now think about extorting you. So again, this is actually happening now. It's beginning to become big business, and the bad guys have realised they can make a lot of money from it. So, as I've said, it's all doom and gloom, so we may as well give up now. But again, I think if you look at trying to be a bit more practical in the world of cybersecurity, particularly in financial services, how can you deal with this new world of cyber risk? I think the first thing for me is be informed. So understand that this stuff is actually happening out there. And again, the stuff I'm saying is not made up. Again, anybody that wants to, you can Google it. This is actually happening now. It's not as prevalent as, or it's not, I would say, in the press maybe as much as it should be. The bad guys know about this, but not everybody in the room and elsewhere out there actually know about this stuff. So for me, the first thing is be informed that this is happening and that this is out there. The second thing I would say is be creative. So think about where the bad guys are going to go next. What is it they could really do to cause pain points? And for me, I mean, we've seen obviously extortion, we've seen super extortion, where now organisations, rather than paying the sort of $500, $1,000, that sort of stuff, we've now seen extortion attempts for organisations of over $1 million, and they have been paying. So the bad guys have been able to work out the specific pain points in the organisation and get now millions of dollars out of them. So again, this stuff is happening. If you want to really ramp things up, then you look to see what's next. And for me, what's next, and I haven't heard of any instances of this happening yet, but maybe other people have, is loss of life. So again, I will crash this plane or crash all these cars or take down these hospitals or whatever else unless you pay this ransom demand or extortion demand. So that's, I think, where things are going to be. Is it going to be a year out, 5 years out? I don't know, but again, this is going to happen. The other thing I would also say is agility is key. And we've heard about this a number of times already today, and I absolutely agree with it, that again, regulation can't keep up. The good guys, the people coming up with the latest cyber solutions and software and capabilities, again, it's difficult, I would say, for us to always keep up with the bad guys and what they're doing. We as a firm are trying to be more proactive, so we are genuinely now thinking more like the bad guys. What type of attack could happen next? What would we do if we were the bad guys? So we're coming up with some fairly novel techniques and approaches to deal with it. And again, I'd encourage everybody to be doing the same. I think if you look at the bad guys, they're being more creative. They are working more collaboratively with each other. So it used to be each hacking group in each country would often sort of work only in their own environment. But again, the Brazilian hackers are now working very closely with the Russian hackers who are working with whoever else. And again, they're bringing the best of their capabilities to really cause those pain points and share the wealth. So again, my view is, and again, we are seeing this in financial services, it is about sharing our knowledge, sharing our views and approaches, and being creative wherever possible. In terms of embracing new technologies to all of this, I mean, one of the key points about today is talking about cryptocurrency, and again, that's all good and no issues from my end. But again, I think it is about understanding what are the risks associated with it. How do you deal with these? How do you be proactive wherever possible? And I think it's, for me, it is often about being over-reliant and under-resilient. And I think that's often a watchword in business. It's about trying to be as efficient as possible, try and almost do things as cheaply as possible, which is fine, but what happens when things go wrong? And again, you need to be thinking about those approaches in the world of new technology, whether it's cryptocurrency or whatever else. Think about algorithm agility or whatever else you want to be thinking about in case something does go wrong. If you look at cryptocurrency specifically, the technology itself, again, in my view, there's nothing wrong with it. But again, often it's the implementation. How well has it been implemented? Are people following all the right approaches with it? And also things like the weakest link. And what is the weakest link with anything in regards to security? We've already heard about it from me and others. It's the people. So again, how are people protecting their cryptocurrency themselves? And people should be educated in terms of this whole area. The final point I would also say is that security is additive. So all those things that I was talking about 20-something years ago when I first got involved in security, that's all still true. Make sure you've got good passwords and you wear your security passes or whatever else you do. You've still got to do all of that stuff. Keep patching your systems and whatever else, do penetration testing. But start thinking about some of the newer things as well. Look at how you can use new technology, solutions, whatever else to protect yourselves. That's me. Thank you.
Dr. Geers, third. Thank you.
Hi, so my background is kind of in government, and I worked for 20 years in government at NSA on, you could say, offense, and at NCIS, like the TV show, on defense. And then I worked at NATO and in academia on special teams. That's American football, I guess, terminology. And I think that for me, because I've lived quite a lot in Europe as well, is that, and I study cybersecurity, you know, from an academic perspective now. Really the key piece, I think, is that it's international by nature, and you're kind of stuck within your own jurisdiction and sovereignty in ways that really limit you. So I spent some years in the basement of the Pentagon trying to work on this attribution problem closer to the year 2000. And we're doing all of this log file searching and analysis of exfiltrated data. And pretty much, of course, a lot of it was the Chinese, you know, stealing information. And but what it looked like, it was going to, not directly to China, but it would go to Maryland, to Pennsylvania, down the street to Arlington, Virginia, maybe to Canada, you know, and then somewhere else, and then somewhere else, and then probably back to China. And so, and I think, just like a lot of the old hacker movies from the 80s and 90s, it's true that back then, really the big question was the attribution problem. Who's attacking you in cyberspace? You didn't really know. Like several occasions, we thought it was, you know, Russia or China, and it wound up being a teenager. In one case in Sacramento, another case in Montreal, and another case in Israel. And then enterprises didn't really have professional cybersecurity staffs that they have today. But now, over the past 15 years or so, you know, people have invested. They've got professionals, and at least they have fences and guard dogs. So now we kind of know who's attacking us in cyberspace, but the question really is, what are you going to do about it? What can you do about it? And I think even the US government is struggling with this issue with all of its military might, right? So I lived in Estonia for 4 years. I moved there during its crisis with Russia in 2007. And at that time, there was a big question. It still seemed like science fiction. President Ilves went to the White House, raised his hand and said, "We are under attack," right? And, you know, there's a kind of, you know, a deep think across, you know, the national security analysis space. But just this week, you may have seen in the news that NATO decided to stand up their new cyber operations center. It's operational in nature, and so it took about 10 years. And that's the nature of the problem, I think. It's a very slippery space because it's very different. I was at NSA when they basically kind of had lots of lectures on, okay, now you need to think about less in terms of human to human and more in computer to computer, what they called C to C communications, because already way back then they said, did you know already that computers are talking to each other far more than humans talk to each other? And so that problem is only getting worse, basically. And like one, you know, like the Ashley Madison affair, for example, one interesting aspect among others is that a lot of men were chatting with robots, right? They thought they were people and they were not. They were chatting with code. And this is where we are now, you know, in terms of, you know, you could argue that you know, we're approaching, you know, some kind of, obviously the IT revolution is taking us, it's on the cusp of basically of so revolutions that we can't even, for example, the US election in 2016 in Washington, DC. I still don't think we really understand what happened there. And a lot of it's information operations, a lot of it's cyber espionage gone operational. But I even think if hackers, basically hacked the ballot box and changed the vote, no, we wouldn't know it. We don't have the expertise. We don't have the ability to audit and validate that vote. And we were talking about, states that encompass millions of voters, and the difference was 70,000 between 3 or 4 states. That's razor thin, basically. So it's a challenge. I moved from Estonia to Ukraine, and I did a research project for for NATO there on the cyber dimension of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. So the difference, but even 7 years between Estonia and Ukraine is phenomenal, because if you think about Estonia in 2007, it was primarily an effort to knock some websites offline via denial of service attack. And that had the potential to be a national security crisis, but it was relatively short in duration and scope, and many Estonians never, knew that they had been hit. In Ukraine today, it's much different. So you find lots of attacks in every sector of the economy, every vertical. And in diplomacy, there was, U.S. diplomats had their conversations snatched by traditional SIGINT, uploaded to YouTube and announced on Twitter, right? This should have been a big warning, right, to the West that, that things are getting multifaceted or combined arms strategy, right, in cyberspace. So in the 2014 election in Ukraine, presidential election, when the polls closed that day, a far-right candidate who actually got very few votes was announced the winner on the official election website, and that was immediately broadcast on Russian nightly news, right? This also should have been a huge warning to the West, right, that it's possible to hack elections. I mean, election fixing was happening before the internet, right? So one way to understand, I think, to better understand computer network operations is just to study intelligence and law enforcement issues, before the internet, because it's the same issues. It's fraud and it's theft. And if you think about cyber attacks, there's really 3 basic forms. I can steal your data, I can block you from seeing your data, or I can manipulate your data. And that is the most alarming of all, right? So changing the 1s to the 2s, and try and find that everywhere in the code. So I don't know, among other things, I did a big talk, I think in 2004 in Las Vegas on what does the Arab-Israeli conflict look like in cyberspace. As it turns out, it's all there, or every bit of it, from planting mines to sending propaganda to trying to massage public opinion in peacetime, right? And it's been there for a long time. It's just that it's hard to pull data points together, and especially with a kind of IR analysis in writing. But I think 3-letter agencies have been doing this kind of thing for a long time, and it's only later that you can kind of pull it all together and understand. In the case of the United States, I think it's whether we could fix some of these electoral shortcomings before the next election, and that's a big question, because again, I'll end on the international nature of the problem. So I think the best place to see progress on cybersecurity will be in the EU and NATO. And the reason for that is because it's fundamentally an international problem. It's an international space that requires an international solution. The United States, despite having nuclear weapons, can only do so much in cyberspace because there's only one internet and one cyberspace. But if you think about 29 combined network security, law enforcement, counterintelligence personnel working together, that's pretty formidable, actually. And I think even from a Moscow or Beijing perspective, the combined weight of all of these allies working together significantly expands the space for collaboration, and it shrinks the space for actors with malicious intent to act with impunity. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Geers.
Thanks.